My name is Ben Saunders. This is my Above and Beyond story. It's a story about an expedition. I've spent the last 20 years leading expeditions in the high Arctic and in Antarctica. And this particular journey happened in the Antarctic summer. We started in October 2013 and finished in February 2014. Summer, misleading term because it is still the coldest place on Earth. And this was a journey that lasted 3.5 months, 108 days in total, with one teammate, a wonderful friend of mine called Tarka Lepeniere. Tarka is half French, hence the name. We've been friends now for, probably about 15 years. And our plan, very simply, was to walk from the coast of Antarctica to the South Pole and then back to the coast again, starting and finishing at a place called Ross Island, which is on the very coast of Antarctica, the sort of New Zealand side of the Antarctic continent. And it is where both Captain Scott and Sir Ernest Shackleton started their expeditions from just over a century ago, trying to become the first to reach the South Pole. Now, our expedition was called the Scott Expedition. We named it after Captain Scott. What we found back in 2013 was that very few people knew that the journey that had defeated Shackleton and ultimately killed Captain Scott and his men still remained unfinished. No one had ever walked from the edge of Antarctica to the South Pole back to the coast again. So that, in a nutshell, is what we set out to do. Simple sounding plan. It was a little bit more complex in practice. A huge project, the biggest expedition I've done in a career spanning 2 decades now. And it involved a huge team. We had about 12 people working full time on the project before we left the UK. We got to Antarctica through South America. So we flew all the way down to Santiago in Chile, down to a town called Punta Arenas, southern tip of Patagonia, South America. And then we flew across to Antarctica, but we had to get to the other side. So we had 3 days of flying just to get from the southern tip of South America to our start point on the New Zealand side of Antarctica. So we were dragging everything we thought we would need for 3.5 months. So all our food, our shelter, tent, sleeping bags, all of the survival gear we'd need, all of the technology we'd need to not only to navigate, to document the journey, but also to kind of share the story in real time. So we had some really cool tech. We had a website. We were updating every day from our tent every evening via satellite. And we had a lot of people following along, lots of comments every day on the website. Antarctica is an extraordinary place. It's a continent. It's the size of roughly China and India put together. So it's massive. It is the coldest place on the planet. It is the driest place on the planet. It's a desert, technically. It has less precipitation than Africa, driest place on Earth. It is the windiest place on Earth. Highest ever wind speeds on the planet were recorded in Antarctica. It is the highest altitude continent on Earth. Most of this big plateau in the middle averages about 2,500 meters above sea level. So it is a land of extremes. And this was a journey that entailed going above and beyond in every sense of both of those words. Both of our GPSs, when we finished the journey, said 1,795 miles. So we assumed naturally that was how far we'd walked. We had an email a few weeks later from an expert in GPS and sort of satellite tracking and mapping. And he said, well, Ben, you understand that number is undoubtedly wrong. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, GPS assumes the Earth is a perfect sphere, which apparently it's not. It's kind of squished a bit at the top and the bottom. So he reckoned we walked 6 miles further. So 1,801 statute miles was the total round trip. And we were traveling on skis, wearing harnesses, dragging sledges that at the start had 200 kilos each. So that's like dragging 2 rugby players in a bathtub for nearly 70 marathons back to back in the coldest, windiest, driest, highest altitude place on Earth. So it's a journey that took an awful lot out of us. It was the biggest project I've ever undertaken. It's the expedition I'm most proud of looking back. And we started from exactly the same place that Captain Scott did, because his wooden hut, his Terra Nova hut, is still standing on the shore of Ross Island. So we had about 20 minutes looking around this extraordinary place, and then we set off. Now, the only living things, the only indigenous life in Antarctica, the birds, the seals, the penguins, the whales, they all live around the coast where the conditions are mildest, and there's food from the sea. But once you get into the middle of Antarctica, it is pretty much a giant white desert, nothing living at all. We started our journey by walking across an area called the Ross Ice Shelf, which is about the same size as France, or California, roughly. We walked diagonally across it. Unlike France, no hills, no valleys, no cheese, no wine, nothing at all. We walked in a straight line for 28 days. We would finish each day 9 or 10 hours after we started at somewhere that looked exactly the same as where we set off from that morning. So mentally it became as challenging as it was physically. There's not much going on. The scenery doesn't change much. Eventually, 4 weeks in, we got to the Trans-Antarctic Mountains, which was stunning, one of the most remote mountain ranges on the planet. We had to find a tiny little gap, a little feature called the Gateway, discovered by Shackleton on his Nimrod expedition. Pretty magical experience sort of getting there. And then once we were sort of through the Gateway up this long snow ramp, we entered the Beardmore Glacier, one of the largest valley glaciers on Earth. And that basically is the kind of ice highway that Shackleton discovered that took him and his men up to the Antarctic plateau towards the pole. Captain Scott followed exactly the same route. So we were literally following in their footsteps. And the glacier, the Beardmore Glacier, was in some ways a real highlight of that trip because it was physically beautiful, really dramatic terrain. You're traveling up through the mountains, the surface changes, you're no longer skiing on snow, you're wearing crampons on this incredible blue ice surface, rock hard. It's really slippery, so the sledges just glide along, so that's great. The scenery's beautiful. We would see valleys every day stretching off east and west that we were sure no one had ever walked down. So it was a really magical place. And then every big mountain, there's one called the Cloudmaker that Shackleton named. And sure enough, the entire week we were on the Beardmore, there was a little cloud above it. So it was such a special place, and it felt like being kind of beamed into the pages of a storybook that had inspired me since I was a kid. It was also, however, pretty nerve-wracking. The glacier is covered in crevasses, these deep cracks in the glacial ice. Tarka and I both had, on the way up, a couple of minor falls into crevasses, putting a foot through into a hole, that kind of thing. The scary moment came on the way back down, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. So we climbed the Beardmore, it took us a week. Once we got onto the plateau, we were over 2,500 meters, between 2,500 and 3,000 meters above sea level. We'd acclimatized quite slowly, so we didn't get altitude sickness, but it was still high enough elevation to make life harder. We'd find ourselves getting out of breath. Even things like the stove we had to melt snow every morning, every evening to get our drinking water, to make hot drinks, to rehydrate our food. Even the stove becomes less efficient at altitude. So everything kind of got harder on the plateau. And once again, after we'd left the final valley, final sort of mountains and peaks of the Beardmore, we were back onto this featureless plateau with another 3 weeks, I think, to the South Pole. Finally got to pole. I think it was 61 days in. Kind of weird feeling. I am here, standing here at the South Pole. It's the 26th of December 2013. Got my flag. Here's the pole. I think for most people nowadays, the South Pole is the destination. That's where you'd be celebrating. But for us, it was halfway. So we spent 20 minutes or so at the pole. We were just determined to stand there, take a photo, make a couple of phone calls, call my mum, and then we turned around as quickly as we could, started walking back to the coast again. And we were literally retracing our steps. I thought before we started that journey that this was going to be the easiest bit. On the way out, we were dragging these super heavy sledges. We'd left 10 depots. We'd buried 10 caches of food and fuel that we'd sort of pick up on our way back. So on the way back to the coast, we were, for parts of it, literally traveling downhill. The sledges were relatively light because we're just hopping between these depots on the way home. So I thought that was going to be easy. The reality was that it was incredibly challenging indeed, to the point where we found ourselves really on the ragged edge of human endurance, I guess. I lost 22 kilos in the 3.5 months we were out there. So I came back home pretty exhausted. We had some of the worst weather of the whole trip. It got really windy, really cold, really poor visibility. So we were running more slowly than we expected. And very quickly, we realized we were going to run out of food before we got to this first depot. So we decided for a few days to try and eke out the rations that we had. We had half rations, I think, for 8 days. My memories are pretty blurry. We were pretty knackered at that point. I can't even find the words to describe how physically, mentally, emotionally drained we were, trying to do these big days, big mileages in really poor weather, trying to get to this first depot. We both started getting ill. We both had hypothermia at various points. And I kind of realized as the leader of this thing that we'd crossed that boundary between being, brave and bold and progressive and innovative and courageous and being reckless. And I decided we were just taking too much risk. We were nearly out of food. We had half a day's food left. We had about 2 or 3 days of travel to get to this first depot. The weather was still horrendously bad, real storm going on. Tarka had been quite ill the day before. And I kind of realized that I had to make a decision. We could either quit, we could call for a plane to evacuate us, take us back to the coast, back home eventually. We could head out into the storm, hope that we got lucky, hope that we could do some enormous record distance on half a day's food and somehow get to this depot. But that felt too dangerous. So I decided maybe there was a third option, and that was to have some food dropped off, basically airdropped to our location. At the time, that felt like failure. My dream had been to make this journey with absolutely no outside support, and here I was, as the leader of this expedition, potentially having to ask for help. We had ultimates. What we did, we had 8 days of food airdropped to our location. We had a day off. We had 24 hours lying in the tent, gorging ourselves on food before we set off again, which was like a bit of a party. But at the time it felt like failure. It felt like compromise. Now looking back, genuinely one of the proudest decisions of my entire life. I'm not sure that I would be here at warm and safe at home if I hadn't made that call. I'm not sure Tarka would be safely back at home in Chamonix. And I think that was the kind of moment where I maybe matured a bit as a leader. And I think it kind of brought me up against my own drive for perfectionism. This was so close to being the ultimate embodiment of everything I was passionate about, and we were going to be doing it in the perfect, purest fashion, and here we were having to compromise. Of course, in hindsight, this is an environment where there are so many crucial factors completely outside your control. You are totally at the mercy of nature and these natural forces at their most powerful. We had to ask for help. 8 days food airdropped, and then we carried on back down the Bimor Glacier, back across the Ross Ice Shelf. At some point near the mountains on the Ross Ice Shelf, we knew that we'd passed the point where Captain Scott had died in 1912. We knew that beyond that we were in uncharted territory. No one had ever walked that far before. So it was kind of weird feeling, I guess, kind of stepping into the record books. And then finally, 108 days after we started, we reached the finish line, this kind of rocky, rubbly shore of Ross Island. In some ways, a kind of weird anticlimax. I'd always imagined that achieving the biggest goal I'd ever set myself, when we stepped across that line, that there'd be this incredible feeling of sort of elation and happiness. But I think at that immediate moment, it was just relief that we had finished. We'd made it back safely. We didn't have to drag our sledges any further. We were done. Feeling of happiness, satisfaction came eventually. It took a while. It was like a slow thing to happen. And looking back, without doubt, my proudest achievement. We covered, let's say, 1,801 miles, about 2,900 kilometers roughly. Tarka and I still hold the world record for the longest ever polar journey on foot. We made the first ever return journey to the South Pole, and we finished for the first time the journey that defeated Sir Ernest Shackleton on his Nimrod expedition, and killed Captain Scott and his teammates on their Terra Nova expedition. So it was a special project, and it's left me with some really treasured memories. 3.5 months sharing a tent with a great friend of mine in the most extraordinary place on earth. So it was a genuine adventure. We went above and beyond in every sense, and some magical treasured memories. That's it for my above and beyond story. I hope you enjoyed it. If you've got any questions, feel free to post them in the comments section. Hopefully you can join me in a few days' time for a live Q&A where I will do my best to answer them.